Good morning, church. I'm truly thankful for all of you that continue to participate in the 7-minute devotions. And as we continue morning by morning, diving into the Word, remember to keep your focus on Him and allow God to lead you every step of the way. With that, let's begin. I'm sure many of you already know, but just in case you forgot, I grew up in a very large family, a family of 8. Now, whenever people hear that I grew up with 5 sisters and no brothers, the usual questions I hear are things like, how did you survive? Or what was that like? Were you okay? And a lot of the times in the people's voices that ask these questions, it's like almost as if they think I lived a miserable life having no brothers. Now, and for the record, it's not true. I was anything but miserable. It was actually really great. Having such a big family always meant that there was something going on, and it was always fun just being together and just doing things as a large family. But of course, there are some struggles and challenges that come with being a part of a large family. For example, things like shopping for food, usually you have to buy bulk. Going out to eat, usually you have to put tables together, or sometimes you have to wait because there's no tables to sit at. Transportation in one car usually never happens. The list goes on and on. Now, I'm super thankful for my family in which I grew up in, with all the great moments. But when I was growing up, I really wanted a baby brother. You see, having all these sisters was great, it was fantastic, but I always, on the back of my mind, wondered what life would have been like if I actually had a baby brother. And I remember as a kid, every time my mother was pregnant, I would think of all the names that my baby brother could have. And I just couldn't wait for her to come home to bring me the good news that I was going to have a baby brother. But quite unfortunately, after 3, 4, or 5 sisters, I gave up. But I remember every time my mother would tell me that I would have another sister, I was devastated. I remember crying and thinking of how unfair life was. It was just terrible. But when I went on my year-long mission trip to Tennessee through 1,000 Missionary Movement, I ended up becoming an assistant boys dean. But up until this point in my life, I had never dormed for one, and I've never lived with a bunch of other guys. But I remember thinking it was almost as if I had just gotten 31 little brothers. We lived together, we celebrated together, we cried together, we grew up together, we sang songs together, we traveled, we worked, we did all of these things together that it really became one of the greatest highlights of my mission trip experience. Now, there's a saying that kind of describes this type of relationship, but the saying goes, a brother from another mother. Of course, none of us were blood related, but the ideal of this is that you're so close, that you're such good friends, that it's almost as if you were actual brothers. And this bond and this friendship is possible when you have similar interests, feelings, or goals. Today we begin and end with a super short book of the Bible, which is the book of Philemon. Now, this is a letter written by Paul to a man by the name of Philemon, who was a Christian slave owner. And that really wasn't uncommon in biblical times. But basically, the message of this letter is simple. It's a plea from Paul to Philemon to accept a runaway slave who had run away from his owner, Philemon. And the slave's name is Onesimus, and he was recently converted to believe in Jesus by Paul. Now, the letter is actually the shortest letter that Paul wrote. It's kind of like a postcard, but it's the only time where Paul is not addressing an issue at a church, but rather talking with an individual. Some would say it's even more intimate than Paul's final letter, 2 Timothy, because of the fact that Paul is not addressing any issues, but rather this kind of direct message between him and a good friend of his. Now, we don't know much about Philemon, other than the clues that we get from within this letter, but also some pointers from another letter of Paul, which is the letter to the Colossians. In short, it said that Philemon was a Christian slave owner who was a part of this church in Colossae. Now, the first part of the letter, Paul points to the fact about Philemon, who was a very well-established individual in this church. Philemon basically had opened up his own home for the church to gather and meet. He paints this picture that Philemon was demonstrating his love and concern for the gospel message. And the language that Paul continues to use in the letter shows that they were really brothers from another mother. From verse 8 to the end of this letter, Paul presents his plea. Check it out. Philemon verse 15 to 17. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. He is very dear to me, but even dearer to you, both as a fellow man and as a brother in the Lord. So if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. You see, Paul's plea is that Philemon would accept Onesimus back, but not as a slave, but as a brother. Now, we don't know what reasons this slave ran away in the first place, but the point is, accept him with open arms. But this is crazy talk, because by law, Philemon had every right to his slave. And for a slave to run away, whatever the reason is, that means he has the right to put his slave to death. Yet Paul is suggesting something else, something that is more in line with what the gospel is all about. Because remember, Philemon is demonstrating his love and concern for the gospel message. So Paul is kind of pointing towards that. And the ideal is that gospel is for all people, including your runaway slave. Now, Paul takes it a step further when you look at verse 17. He encourages Philemon to welcome back Onesimus as if he were welcoming his brother from another mother. And in this case, it's Paul. Now, the Greek word that he uses in 17, partner, comes from the word koinonos, right? Which comes from the word koinonia, which is the ideal of people sharing a common interest, feelings, and goals. In other words, it's a partnership that is based on something mutual. This word is used about 20 times in the Bible, and it's all used to describe the church or this community. And it talks about this fellowship, the sharing of common interest, feelings, and goals. But you see, and you probably already know, that we are very different people. When you go to church, there are so many different views and differences among us. Different perspectives, different politics, different theologies. Yet what Paul is trying to paint and what he's trying to remind us is that our partnership, our koinonia, has to be based on Jesus. So church, remember this. The center point of the church is founded in the gospel message. We are brothers and sisters in Christ.